Nero fiddles while Rome burns. That about sums up the state of fiscal responsibility or lack thereof of the people we elect these days as they run up annual federal budget deficits of between half a trillion and $1 trillion, and the national debt has ballooned to a staggering $22 trillion, with millions more added to the debt every day. What's the end game on this national debt? How exactly will it affect the American people? And how close are we to a tipping point? Joining us to analyze this under the radar crisis is LibertyNation.com economics correspondent Andrew Moran. And Andrew, after the Revolutionary War, way back when, and facing massive deficits, Alexander Hamilton said the only way to repair the deficit was to grow our way out of it. And they did grow out of it. We've seen economic growth these days a doubling since Trump took office. Can we grow our way out of this debt crisis?
Well, I think one thing that we saw with the historic Republican tax code was that, pro-business legislation can grow the economy. Corporations are boosting compensation packages. The U.S. economy is averaging about 200,000 new jobs a month and hourly wages that are all-time high. So it is true that these tools might be exhausted with the recent economic data, but I don't think anyone can dismiss the power of this type of these types of bills, whether it's tax cuts or less regulation. The problem, however, is that when the economy grows, the government also grows, and that's the main issue with the debt. Is that the economy could bring in about $20 trillion in revenues, but the government would still find a way to spend $23 trillion. So rather than cutting and spending or shrinking the size of government, administrations, whether they're Republican or Democrat, they always agree to increase it. And this is, you see it throughout every administration. It happened with Reagan. Reagan is viewed as this great fiscal conservative icon. It's true, he slashed taxes and regulations and he boosted the economy. The spending was actually 3% higher than the 40-year average at the time, and the country went deeper into debt. But I think it was $2 trillion by the end of his 8 years.
Now, as we talk about a frightening national debt, 22 trillion and growing by the day, that's 22 with 12 zeros after it. What areas in particular will suffer as a result of this out of control national debt?
I think you should have your razor blades in order because everything will be affected. America's finances are atrocious right now. You have $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities and expenditures. You have Medicare and Social Security on the brink of insolvency. Interest payments are soon going to top $1 trillion. And then the Treasury, they recently announced that they're borrowing $1 trillion for the second consecutive year to fund all of this deficit finance spending. Politicians seem to think that the debt going up $1 trillion a year is feasible, but it never lasts forever, and it can't last forever. You see this every time in the debt ceiling debate. Both sides grandstand, and in the end of it, the Republicans and Democrats, they just throw their hands up in the air and agree to raising the debt once again. So there's only so much there's only so much money you can tax, borrow, and then of course only so much money you can print. No matter how much the MMT or the modern monetary theorists believe that you can print infinitely as long as you fund some progressive cause du jour. But perhaps maybe I have too much faith in the intellect of politicians, but it is inevitability that the government has to make tough choices, even if it means losing an election. They'll have to either reform entitlements, or they'll have to take an axe to the budget, or God forbid, they have to be honest with the electorate and say we can't afford this, these great times anymore. So that's the optimistic scenario, and I think the other bad option is you either inflate the money supply and devalue the currency in half, or you just admit to the world, hey, we're bankrupt.
Well, what's the tipping point on this debt, Andrew? Many economists have said when the national debt reaches about 25 trillion, we'll really be up against it and at a point of no return. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the 25 trillion is an arbitrary figure because I think the U.S. government has already passed the tipping point. I remember during the financial crisis, there was a gentleman by the name of David Walker. He was the former comptroller general of the United States, and he sounded the alarm about all this spending and debt. And his prediction was that eventually the U.S. will only be able to afford paying the interest on the debt and perhaps some entitlements, and that's it. And that's a pretty haunting prognostication, and that's a quite likely scenario. Once Social Security folds, then that's the domino effect of everything else within governments. You won't be able to afford anything anymore. And then the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. The U.S. government can only be thankful that the rate hikes were paused.
Well, that about sums it up, doesn't it? Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew Moran, economics correspondent for LibertyNation.com.